At the core of Mega Man Zero lies the superb set of movement mechanics that makes the X games so much fun to play. Zero can dash, jump off walls, and string it all together seamlessly, while the controls are as tight as they've always been and arguably even tighter. Despite using a new engine for the Game Boy Advance, developer Inti Creates recreated much of the overall speed, weight, and response of the character, but fine-tuned every last detail to perfection. I've never encountered dropped inputs, unlike in the SNES X installments, and there's no weird delay to starting and ending a dash, unlike in the PS1 X installments. Carried over too is the Z-Saber combat that defines Zero's playstyle. Tearing through enemies is mighty satisfying, thanks in part to them getting visibly sliced in half now before exploding, and new is the ability to perform a slash while walking, as well as dash into an attack. Similarly, gone is the clumsy Z-Buster that turns you into a sitting duck. In its place, you have a buster akin to X's that allows you to shoot while on the move, distilling the two protagonists from X4 through 6 down into this iteration of Zero, and it plays like an absolute dream. Beyond these familiar basics, however, Mega Man Zero, in launching a new series, forgoes key traditions of the franchise and replaces them with tweaked or wholly new systems and mechanics. The first significant departure is that you don't obtain special firearms from defeated bosses. Zero may be rocking Mega Man's Buster now, but the trademark selling point of 8 modifiers is a thing of the past. On the surface, this seems like a major loss. It was always a Mega Man staple to have this big new toolkit to toy around with each entry, figuring out what the best options were for different situations and how to adjust your stage order accordingly. At least, that's the idea behind it all. In reality, games that have a well-rounded roster are the exception rather than the rule from my experience. There's typically one or two dominant weapons that overshadow the rest, and as the X series introduced stuff like dashing, wall jumping, armor upgrades, and a slew of other mechanics, the entire concept gradually lost its allure. In those games, I often find myself reverting to the trusty Mega Buster because it works well universally with its potent charge shot, whereas most of the special weapons have niche applications at best and feel impractical or weak in the grand scheme of things. It just seems like a burden to keep thinking up 8 weapons that are unique, useful, and balanced, and since Zero is known for his melee combat anyway, I'd say Mega Man Zero was a great opportunity to buck the trend and curate a smaller arsenal. Completing missions still rewards you with a diverse array of different tools and items, but among these are merely 2 additional melee weapons. The first is the Triple Rod, a spear with increased range over the Z-Saber that can also stab in 8 directions. This makes it suitable for hitting threats at larger distances and awkward angles, though the real selling point is its ability to bounce off of stuff like a pogo stick. This can be repeated until the enemy or hazard is destroyed, and if multiple targets are lined up in a row, you can chain the effect to bounce off them all without halting your forward momentum. It's as much a platforming tool as it is a weapon, and it's very fun to use. Secondly, there's the Shield Boomerang, which can deflect bullets back to the enemy. Unfortunately, you cannot dash while holding it, and it doesn't protect against any melee attacks nor projectiles from bosses, making the shield functionality pretty niche. As the name implies, however, you can also charge the Shield Boomerang to toss it like a boomerang, which is its redeeming quality. By maneuvering Zero carefully so the weapon has no chance to return to him, it can keep going indefinitely and dish out pain in the process. There's definitely no denying the Z-Saber is still the best all-around weapon, but the Triple Rod and Shield Boomerang have their strengths and inject more variety into the combat than they let on at first. You see, one of the standout aspects about this game is the ability to equip 2 weapons at once. If you want to keep things simple and play this more like a traditional X title, you largely can by going for the Buster and Z-Saber. But if you're feeling more experimental, you can opt for 2 melee options. Not only does this lower the barrier to get good with the Triple Rod and Shield Boomerang, since you don't need to swap out the Z-Saber in order to try them, it also makes Zero a little more versatile in his melee capabilities. In the pause menu, you can switch between 3 control types, but to cut to the chase, Type B is objectively the superior choice and should have at the very least been the default. The reason why is because Type B enables independent charging of both weapons. In other words, you can charge one while using the other, or charge both at the same time and unleash them consecutively. Better yet, it's not just the Buster that can be charged. So can the Z-Saber for the first time since X3, as well as the Triple Rod and Shield Boomerang. We'll get into some of the advanced tech this opens up later, but on a base level, it's an evolved take on the system in X4 through 6, where you could equip a special weapon and fire X's buster with a different action button. The downside was that using one firearm would cancel the charge of the other, so there was limited potential for weapons to follow up on each other. Admittedly, the complete move pool in this game ain't that deep either, since only the Z-Saber has extra tricks up its sleeve, and even then it's only 2, the mid-air spin and a rolling ground slash. This is a little disappointing considering Zero could learn more in prior entries like an uppercut, downward stab, and mid-air dash. It was pretty cool how you could chain these Z-Saber skills together as well, and that would apply doubly so in Mega Man Zero with the ability to wield dual weapons. The thing is, techniques in the PS1X titles were primarily intended as boss weaknesses. Consequently, Mega Man Zero seems to have set them aside a bit, seeing how the new elemental chips already fulfill the role. These chips can be equipped one at a time and create a very literal rock paper scissors scenario where ice bosses are vulnerable to the flame chip, electric bosses to the ice chip, and fire bosses to the thunder chip. This removes the age-old element of needing to figure out boss weaknesses, but to be honest, I can't really lose sleep over that. The fact of the matter is, in most cases, the vulnerability of a Robot Master or Maverick was arbitrary and thus not logically deductible. In light of this, it's not uncommon for players nowadays to look up stage orders to spare themselves the trial and error, and anyone who claims they're not guilty of doing so is a lying coward. The concept was groundbreaking for replayability in the NES era, but the novelty had worn off by the 2000s, I think, and decoupling Zero's techniques from weaknesses is a smart move because it means enemies and bosses won't be resistant to or break apart from any of your melee attacks. You could argue the elemental chips are so basic and obvious they may as well not be in the game, and I don't disagree, but since they're all acquired by finishing different missions, they can still inform your decisions on where to head next, retaining some of that Mega Man DNA. The chips might confuse newcomers initially though, since the game fails to communicate they only work in conjunction with a chargeable weapon. This means you must first either find the shield boomerang, which can be charged out of the gate, or upgrade the Buster, Z-Saber, or Triple Rod to a certain level. See these stars at the bottom of the pause menu? Yeah, new to Mega Man Zero is the weapon level up mechanic, where each weapon gains new techniques as you use it. I guess it's meant to incentivize use of all your weapons, but the implementation has issues. By default, I think it's fair to say Zero is arbitrarily incapable. You cannot use the elemental chips without the ability to charge for one, but by extension that means you cannot even fire a proper charge shot without leveling up the Buster, and in addition to that, you start with only a single slash for the Z-Saber. These limitations make the beginning of the game feel harder than it ought to be, especially if you've played the X series, where a proper charge shot and the 3-slash combo have always been basic powers for X and Zero respectively. The other problem is that over the course of any of my playthroughs, I never managed to fully upgrade all my weapons, at least not organically. As a result, I most usually did not have every technique at my disposal. To add insult to injury, Mega Man Zero actually has a New Game Plus mode, but for some weird-ass reason it resets every weapon back to level 1, plus you need to recollect the Triple Rod and Shield Boomerang. Essentially, there's no practical way to do a repeat playthrough and go ham with all the moves from start to finish, unless you use up all your paid leave for the year and defeat the same enemies over and over and over again to max out each weapon as soon as possible. Be it intentional or not, that's ultimately what the system encourages above all else. Repetitive grinding, even if it's just for a few minutes, to gain the abilities Zero should have from the outset. There are ways Inti Creates could have mitigated this, like decreasing the experience points you gain from repeatedly killing the same enemies, but if I'm honest, I don't think the approach in the X games, that is, Zero learns techniques from defeated bosses, is one that needed replacing to begin with. There was no grinding component to it, every player had all the techniques by the finale, and it created incentive to try out stages in different orders. Alternatively, I would have been cool with finding weapon techniques in the stages. After all, there's still no armor upgrades for Zero, so this also would have been a fitting solution to better preserve the exploration aspect the X series had going for it. Not that this game doesn't have optional items, mind you, which leads us to another new concept known as the Cyber-Elves. found at the end of certain missions as drops from defeating a certain number of enemies, and indeed throughout stages as secrets. Cyber-Elves are one-time use, sentient little data programs that sacrifice themselves to either provide Zero temporary benefits or enhance his abilities permanently. They come in 3 broad flavors: nurse, animal, and hacker, but you can break them down further into 22 different creatures, many having one or more duplicates out there. The selection is a tad bloated, but I'd say there are enough useful Cyber-Elves worth carrying with you. A few examples of what they can do is pull you out of pits, freeze enemies in place for a brief period of time, slow down the clock during events with the timer, create shields over spiked areas to prevent nasty insta-kills, and get rid of knockback when taking damage. As a means of lowering the challenge for those who need it, I think they're actually pretty versatile in that they go beyond the basics of restoring or increasing your health, which reminds me a little bit of the parts in X5 and X6. Sadly, what ends up making Cyber-Elves less rewarding to find than heart tanks, sub-tanks, and armor upgrades in past entries is the fact you need to raise the more powerful elves. There are level 1 types which can be used straight away, but level 2 and 3 types need to be fed energy crystals first. Energy crystals are basically a currency you pick up in stages and from defeated foes, providing additional reason to explore and kill enemies instead of bypassing them. Sounds Gucci, but the catch is the actual requirements. I'd wager the average player who goes through the game normally will have enough crystals at some point to feed a level 2 Cyber-Elf, perhaps 2 of them, but anything more than that is really stretching it. This is rough because all the health upgrades as well as the 4 sub-tanks are of the level 2 or 3 tier. There do exist level 1 nurse types that can heal you once, so if you locate them, you can get some mileage out of those, but most of them restore a pitiful amount of health. The permanent upgrades are simply more robust, prompting many people to farm for energy crystals from respawning enemies, which is yet more mindless busywork. To be fair, you can speed up the process substantially with a specific level 1 Cyber-Elf that guarantees item drops. I would advise using these in general whenever you obtain one to maximize your gains, and there is an area you can revisit twice that will have a bunch more energy crystals, so if you explore thoroughly, you can mitigate the tedium slightly. Still, I hesitate to say the high requirements serve much of a purpose besides padding, and it's hard not to feel cynical about intentions when you consider the level 3 Cyber-Elves. These don't reveal their demands up front. After growing once, they suddenly need even more energy crystals before you can use them. This last step is always incredibly expensive, and you're not going to know about it in advance, so it's a huge waste of your crystals. Overall, I don't dislike the concept of growing Cyber-Elves, but it's way too slow and restrictive as is, which, again, also dampens the excitement of finding an elf in the first place. Lowering the raise requirements would do wonders, and what could then round out the system nicely, maybe, is if energy crystals were also used to buy techniques for the weapons. Think of Devil May Cry and how everything from increased health to new moves is purchased via the red orbs. It forces the player to make choices about what kind of upgrades they prioritize, which, if you do include RPG mechanics into your action game, brings more depth to the table than some kind of linear upgrade path. Speaking of Devil May Cry, I'll also give points to that game for letting you buy more lives, an option that's sorely lacking in Mega Man Zero. That's right, we've reached that part of the video where we get to rag on retry chips, a bad sin that deserves to burn in the fiery abyss of hell. To put it very simply, retry chips are like lives except they aren't replenished when you run out. You can find one in most missions, and it will thankfully respawn upon death, so it is feasible to maintain stock that way, but if you kick the bucket before managing to grab the retry chip or reach the checkpoint for the boss and get wrecked, you're gonna suffer that deficit. In practice, this means it's often the safest choice to just reload your save file whenever you die, to avoid an awful situation where you have no retry chips left, especially considering checkpoints are sparse to begin with. The vast majority of missions have one before the boss, and that's it. If you are so inclined, both factory missions as well as the first and second Neo Arcadia levels do prove themselves to be viable farming spots to max out your retry chips, but replaying stages over and over for this, I can only describe the whole system as yet another pointless time sink and a stark regression from the infinite lives in X5 and X6. Another byproduct of the retry chips is that because reloading your save reverts your progress, you keep losing the energy crystals and weapon level ups you've racked up. This undermines one of the main reasons for having RPG mechanics. Less skilled players are the ones that benefit the most from upgrades, yet for all the time they spend retrying missions in Mega Man Zero, they don't really accrue extra experience points and currency to afford the help they need. I guess you could also opt to give up the mission, but it's not worth the trade-off in the slightest. Sure, you'll keep your energy crystals and weapon stats, but selecting this means you can never attempt the mission again, and remaining items in it are lost for good. Now, I don't hate the idea of such an option, on the contrary, I kinda dig it. If you're seriously hung up on a mission or cannot be bothered with it on repeat playthroughs, I think the freedom to abandon it is pretty novel. It doesn't feel cheap because there's always a cost associated with it, and particularly on the first playthrough, it's risky since you have no clue what you're leaving behind. That said, if you wish to go this route, you should be doing it through the pause menu, from where you can evacuate without sacrificing any retry chips. Meanwhile, if you abort upon a game over, you'll be on the verge of another game over right as you roll into the next mission. It's practically a dead end. So yeah, between the need to level up weapons, to learn techniques, the high cost of raising Cyber-Elves, and finally how lives function, it's obvious why Mega Man Zero is criticized so heavily for its grindy nature. You're not obligated to comply with it, but your handheld or controller might not survive the first playthrough if you don't. And apparently, this was intentional, for one of the goals during development of Mega Man Zero was to make the hardest game in the franchise yet. On the face of it, I think that's fine. Tough as Nails games are always going to be less accessible, but targeting a new series toward the more hardcore seasoned Mega Man player is not a direction I'm inherently against. We really did not need retry chips to get there though, and the overall approach is too wishy-washy. I would respect it more if the devs fully committed to their goal and told players to get good or get lost. I don't see the point in incorporating these built-in tools to lower the difficulty, then locking many of those tools behind an excessive amount of farming in an attempt to discourage players from using them? If that was the intent, there's a more elegant solution present in the game already. After each mission, your performance is graded on criteria like time, damage taken, enemies killed, and indeed, Cyber-Elves used. The higher the level of the elf, the more points you lose, and if an elf provides a permanent upgrade, points will be subtracted on every mission going forward. Not everyone agrees with this practice, argument being that players shouldn't be penalized for utilizing stuff the designers themselves implemented, but I see it more so as rewarding players who are willing to take on a greater challenge, which is standard practice in action games. It lets a wider audience enjoy the adventure via restorative items and other means of assistance, while also encouraging players to rely less on those crutches. The ranking system in Mega Man Zero is peculiar though in that you don't get ranked for each individual mission. The result screen suggests that's the case, but the rank at the bottom is actually based on an invisible average across your playthrough thus far. It's rather obscure, I had no clue until I did research online, but past that I don't dislike it being average based and it doesn't do a whole lot anyway. If you manage to uphold an A or S rank, bosses gain access to a special attack, sort of like a hidden dynamic difficulty. Hardly a big deal, but it's a cool little twist to acknowledge the efforts of dedicated players who put in the effort to master stages and bosses. You want to be quick, but not so quick that you skip too many enemies along the way, while also avoiding damage as much as possible. Personally, I enjoy doing a playthrough where I maintained an A rank throughout. There is a degree of trial and error involved, however, as Mega Man Zero is a certified victim of screen crunch. Now, I'm naturally inclined to cut the devs some slack here, as fast, action-oriented gameplay on the GBA is tricky to get right with such a limited screen resolution, but at the same time, I don't want to brush aside their part in this entirely. I mean, there's always a delicate balancing act to manage between level of detail in the graphics and enemy placement and behavior. Case in point, the PS1X titles. They have more pixels to work with than the SNES trilogy, but that pixel budget was spent on more detailed sprites instead of extended visibility. As such, fast enemies will catch you by surprise equally in all of those games. Mega Man Zero wants to have its cake and eat it too, where it has detailed sprites for the system, but many enemies also run or fly into you or shoot bullets when they're barely on screen. This makes it nigh impossible to react until you've somewhat memorized where threats appear. Either that, or you don't dash at all. It's an option, but it's not very exciting to go slow all the time, and you'll still get blindsided from above anyway. I prefer to just tank the hits, seeing how health pickups drop frequently, so you're not that likely to die from the screen crunch at least. Well, that is until insta-kill hazards or bottomless pits rear their ugly head. The log section in the factory is a prime example. You'll need to cling onto the walls as low as possible to just barely catch a few pixels of log, and the whole section is suspended above a giant abyss because fuck you. This legit has to be the most difficult set piece in the game, just obviously not for the right reasons. Mercifully, poorly designed, lethal scenarios like this don't show up often, but it is frustrating when they do, and they serve as ammunition for my overall argument here. Something I would have loved actually is if the Zero ZX Legacy Collection had addressed these visibility problems. Capcom claimed before release that this collection uses the original source code of each title without any emulation involved. Assuming that's true, it should be feasible from a technical perspective to expand the viewport both horizontally and vertically. Considering the porting team would have had to go back and make lots of manual tweaks to individual stages and bosses, however, it's understandable why this never came to fruition. Just too much investment for a collection of relatively niche games. Additionally, it's only fair I acknowledge other efforts the Zero ZX Legacy Collection did make in order to improve the games. For starters, it brings over the casual scenario from the older collection on Nintendo DS, which starts you with every Cyber-Elf and all the weapons are fully leveled up as soon as you obtain them. I do not recommend this for your first playthrough because there's really not a single ounce of challenge remaining, but it's an accessible way to sink your teeth into the full breadth of the combat without having to grind for it first. Secondly, there's the all-new Save Assist mode, which places a bunch of extra checkpoints, particularly in rough sections like the log carriages in the factory to take off the edge, and because these checkpoints essentially act as save states, they also nullify the retry chips. Unless you're a stickler for original hardware or prefer games unaltered, more power to you. This is what you should be playing if you're new to the Zero series. Not only can you retry challenging parts infinitely, you'll also be building up the raw skill to overcome them more effectively. By extension, this should diminish your need for additional tools and abilities, and thus the need for grinding and farming. Nowhere is this more apparent than Neo Arcadia Core, which hosts both the boss rush and the final bosses. Normally then, if you run out of lives at any point in this stage, you return to the beginning of the boss rush. This is a step back from the X series, where you could keep fighting Sigma until you beat him, a setup that made sense because the final bosses should be the ultimate test of skill before the curtain closes. Being forced to redo the entire boss rush on top of that is just a bridge too far, and the fewer retry chips you've got and the fewer Cyber-Elves you've raised, the more likely a scenario this becomes. Save Assist mode undoes this change, and as an added bonus, you're even spared the tedium of needing to refill your sub-tanks after dying, which is magnificent. You might say all this makes the final bosses too easy, but I think the lighter punishment gives players more confidence to tackle the final bosses with fewer Cyber-Elves, meaning the in-the-moment act of beating them is actually more demanding. But that's okay because you can practice as much as you need to without having to slog through repeated content. It's just a cruel joke in the vanilla game, more so when you take into account not everyone is fond of boss rushes to begin with. Now personally, I've always felt a little conflicted about them. It's like, yeah, it is a showcase of character and player growth, but on subsequent playthroughs it becomes a bit of a ball ache to mow down all these rematches back to back, and in quintessential Mega Man fashion, most bosses here are easily stunned or interrupted by the elemental chips. Fights are more or less decided before they've even started. Worth noting as well is that in the classic and X series, the boss rush helped players discover all the weaknesses. This is irrelevant in Mega Man Zero, so that's one less reason to keep the tradition around. Another reason could be New Game Plus. Had it actually carried over your weapons and chips, I think it would provide a similar power trip, but with the upside of being completely unobtrusive. Regardless, this isn't a hill I'm desperate to die on, especially because Mega Man Zero has relatively short boss intros and explosions, leaving less dead air between the action. Furthermore, if you're dedicated enough, you can learn to demolish bosses in record time, which is where the advanced tech from wielding two weapons comes into play. I won't delve into the nuances, but in a nutshell, the moves of your weapons trigger varying lengths of invincibility frames. Most curiously, while the charge attacks on the Buster, Z-Saber, and Shield Boomerang all cause long iframes, the Triple Rods variant does not due to its continuous damage output as long as it maintains contact. The real magic happens then when you begin stringing together gnarly sequences of attacks with short iframes, stylishly shredding through health bars like it's nobody's business. I question to what extent this combo system was intended, but it's in the game and undeniably awesome. It raises the skill ceiling considerably and makes optimal boss kills look more impressive than ever before in Mega Man history. Of course, putting it all into action is easier said than done. There's a particular rhythm you'll have to master when alternating between two weapons, and you need an intimate understanding of Zero's moves and their properties, as well as the behavior of each boss in order to create openings. After several hours of practice, I was able to book respectable results to show off, I'd say, but I'm still not remotely on the level of someone like Magnus Zero, and on a first playthrough, you shouldn't even entertain the thought of attempting any of this. The bosses in Mega Man Zero are no slouch, and this is evident as soon as the first major encounter, Aztec Falcon. His massive arms shoot lightning arrows and double as shields, making it difficult to land bullets with the Buster, and no pressure on you to hurry up or anything, because there's also a damn time limit. As a result, Aztec Falcon tends to be a roadblock for new players, but he does train you to adopt a certain mindset. Being cautious and chipping away with the Buster is futile, but if you take a moment to observe his patterns and take the initiative with the Z-Saber, you can make absolute mincemeat of him. This lesson will carry you through the more intense bosses, chief among them being Hidden Phantom. This guy has the ninja art down pat. He charges at you with his katana, uses his shuriken as a flying platform while tossing kunai, and splits himself up into multiple shadow clones as a deception technique. Each of these patterns are tricky in their own right, but he also cycles through them with minimal recovery time, putting your reflexes to the test. I adore these kinds of aggressive encounters, and overcoming them recaptures the high of defeating a boss like Magma Dragoon in X4. In addition to being challenging, there's also a healthy variety to the bosses in Mega Man Zero. Take Pantheon Core, one of the earliest bosses, which is completely stationary, but there are pistons that periodically rise up that threaten to squash you into a ceiling of spikes. This makes the challenge more about foresight and positioning. Then there's Anubis Necromancer III, rolls right off the tongue, who summons zombies that grab you and take quite the beating, while he tosses his twirling staff around for you to avoid. Multitasking is the name of the game here, and between attack phases, spiked pillars also rise from the sand that you need to wall jump out of to avoid getting crushed, lending a unique flow to the battle. To my surprise, there's even a devil boss, albeit one that's not so obnoxious. Its most dangerous phase is when the head splits into 2 and then 4 pieces, bouncing around the room. You're free to stick to an upper corner for the duration of it and wait for a safe opening, or if you're confident, you can stay low and aim straight for the main head, which causes it to split instantly. As such, the pace is very much dictated by the player, unlike previous Devil versions that were a drag regardless of one's skill. Now, challenge and variety are positive qualities already, but what impresses me the most is how solid the bosses also are across the board, avoiding issues I've had with one fight or another in the X games. Like, there's the plotting battle, such as Wheelgator in X2, who spends what feels like 80% of the time hiding underwater. The slowest encounter in Mega Man Zero is probably Fairy Leviathan, who drops a bunch of ice crystals that take a moment to fall, but if you're precise enough, you can hit her as she swims up and down. It's not that slow, to be honest, especially with the barrage of projectiles she also fires. Okay, what about the pathetic loop battle like Tunnel Rhino in X3 who gets stuck charging back and forth across the room? Well, Sage Harpuya is the most susceptible to repeating his main pattern, but avoiding damage from it consistently does require precision, and knocking Harpuya down in the wrong spot can corner you. Even X4, which boasts one of the best rosters if you ask me, falters with the final weapon bosses, the biggest atrocity of them all being the Repliforce General when playing as Zero. The Neo Arcadia bosses, on the other hand, fare better, including the final one, Copy X. In the first phase, he can perform the slide and the Nova Strike, using abilities against you that were part of the player's moveset in the Classic and X series, and he's also mastered the 3 elements with a different attack for each, making him pretty versatile overall. Next, in the second phase, you use the makeshift walls to reach Copy X's weak point, but you need to be mindful of the rings that will carry you into the pit below. His fire attack forces you to cling to a wall, however, and dodging his scattering beams requires moving from one side to the other, so obtaining victory is all about paying attention to his visual and audio tells and getting into the groove. The fight can be cheesed somewhat with the range of the triple rod, but on my self-imposed challenge run, which entailed using only the Z-Saber and Buster locked to level 1 in hard mode, it was a nerve-wracking yet fair final boss. This is sort of the standard by which I examined all the bosses, by the way, as upgrades mess with their balance to varying degrees. Obviously, that's the point, but doing a minimalist playthrough is one of my favorite ways to experience Mega Man titles after completing them, because you're pitted against the boss in the rawest form possible. This can expose flaws in their design and patterns that weren't readily apparent before, but I'm happy to report the exercise unearthed very little for this game. Some attacks could benefit from better telegraphing for first-time players, but Mega Man bosses have never been the most consistent in this regard, and once you know, you know. There's nothing like an X6 where circumventing damage is a total crapshoot on certain encounters. Screen crunch can hinder occasionally, as not all of the arenas are enclosed, causing your opponent to go past the border sometimes, but that's really the worst of it. In short, the boss selection here is among the most consistent in the franchise so far, at least to me, and stands out as a highlight of the game. On the flip side, I think much of the level design in Mega Man Zero is nothing to write home about. The best compliment I can give it is that it's mostly devoid of low points. The aforementioned log part sucks, yeah, but I'm drawing a blank otherwise. Coming off the heels of X5 and X6, this is a relief. X5 was plagued by agonizing auto-scrolling segments where almost nothing happened, and X6, while daring with its conceptually varied and demanding stages, was an exasperating experience due to poor execution. Mega Man Zero has far less auto-scrolling, largely keeping the pace up, and the level design is overall straightforward and simple. The reason it's devoid of low points, though, is because it's perhaps too straightforward and simple. Of the main stages, it's only the factory that's noteworthy to me, sporting this section where you have to dodge security cameras to prevent the shutter from closing. If you get caught, you'll have to make a mad dash to slip through, and if you don't make it in time, the mission is considered a failure, forcing a restart. But what's neat is you can also find an alternate entrance higher up in the building that skips the security cameras, rewarding those who explore the outside area more thoroughly. Then, past the shutter, you'll soon run into the logs suspended over a giant bottomless pit, and the level concludes with a series of electrical hazards that get progressively stricter in timings. You can clearly identify the separate chunks here, each with a unique challenge. I struggle to muster up commentary like this for the other main stages. The disposal center has a gimmick where you can change the wind direction with these devices, but this doesn't amount to much because there's minimal platforming. The subway has terrain that collapses under your feet, and there's some platforms that move up and down with enemies on them. That's alright. The hidden base begins with pillars you knock down to make it across a bit of spikes, and once in the water you need to avoid getting crushed by the Replifor ship that slowly bobs up and down. Listen, I don't mean to be reductive by rattling off stage features and set pieces like this, but the problem is that the above covers the majority of them. I would tell you about the desert and the underground laboratory as well, but they border on being flat lines with enemies on them. It's all perfectly harmless and serviceable stuff, mind you, but doesn't aspire to be anything remarkable. Compounding the matter is the fact there are only 6 main levels, and the underground laboratory even doubles as the intro stage. How does that work, you ask? Well, rather than being one and done, every stage has 2 missions to complete. At some point then, you return to the underground laboratory, except you go through it backwards to retrieve data that was left behind. This retreading of ground, but with different enemies thrown in or an extra stipulation stitched on top, is the biggest giveaway that Inti Creates was pressed for ideas and resources in developing the level design. In the desert, your initial objective is to find a hostage at the end and escort him back to the start, at a leisurely pace I might add. But then on the second visit, you also make it to the end, just with more fodder on the path, and you don't need to escort someone back to the start. Similarly, the layout of the factory remains unmodified on your second visit, except the security cameras are disabled and instead, you are deployed to disarm bombs within a generous time limit. What a riveting twist, bro, but have fun doing the log section a second time. Granted, not all the secondary objectives are this shameless. The hidden base undergoes a change as it contains frozen water on the first visit that leads to a prison area where you rescue a bunch of soldiers. Then, on the return, the ice is melted, revealing the aforementioned Replifor ship, allowing you to destroy hacking devices up ahead. There's still overlap between the two missions, however, as you do the trip to the depths of the base twice, which is why I think the disposal center and subway are the most graceful examples. The former gets invaded by a giant mining mechanoloid, shifting your focus to defeating the mini-boss, with the stage merely serving as a backdrop, and the latter is basically split up into two halves, letting you explore a different half in each mission. If we have to have 2 objectives per stage, ideally this is how it's done. Sadly, the turnout is too repetitive too often, and it's clearly meant to obfuscate how thin this game is on proper stage content. Genuinely, without the recycling of stage content, this might be the shortest entry in the Mega Man franchise since 1 on the NES. The silver lining here, at least, is that the Neo Arcadia levels, equivalent to the Wily Castle and Sigma Fortress levels, are pretty good, and thankfully lack multiple missions. The core primarily houses the boss rush, but the tower is one of my favorite stages, simply for being a tall vertical shaft. I'm not kidding. It starts kind of mid, with an elevator ride you regrettably cannot speed up. I wish you somehow could, like in X3's Gravity Beetle area, but once the level gets going, it's pure bliss. As you scale the tower, you face enemies, interact with a couple different platform types, and navigate spikes, the makeup of a stage that allows you to flex your wall jumping muscles. It's exhilarating seeing how one slip up can spell your demise, but the bolder and cleaner your execution is, the better you'll be able to maintain a continuous flow to the top. Mastering this climb harkens back to the joy of nailing stages like Boomer Kuwanger, Flamestag, and Toxic Seahorse, which I consider among the best in their respective titles, because wall jumping as a mechanic is such a central pillar of Mega Man X. I want to say it remains so in Mega Man Zero, but the game doesn't quite scratch the itch when, barring Neo Arcadia Tower, it only sporadically teases you with snippets of vertical platforming. As for the stage that comes before the tower, Neo Arcadia Shrine, it consists of multiple floors, if you will, each with a mini-boss you must defeat before advancing, which is a cool premise, and along the way you have a nice blend of combat and obstacles. A guilty pleasure of mine is honestly the throwback to the appearing and disappearing blocks. It's completely artificial that you cannot wall jump off them, but this does make it so you have to react very quickly and jump to the next block with precision. Luckily, there's no abyss or spikes underneath you like in many of the classic titles, so messing up isn't that soul-crushing. That being said, what elevates this stage are the secrets it holds. There are numerous goodies tucked away in devious spots. My apologies if the footage spoils you on some of it, and I have to give a shout out to this specific instance involving a conspicuous gyro cannon. On my first playthrough, I sort of neglected it because it flies too high to triple rod bounce off of, but a detail I came to notice later on is that if you hit the propellers of a gyro cannon and not the body itself, it will fall down without exploding. This knowledge made me put 2 and 2 together, and sure enough, when I reached the shrine again, that one conspicuous gyro cannon revealed more foes that led to 2 Cyber-Elves, which was very fulfilling to uncover. Now, as I've said before, Mega Man Zero overall does have optional items to seek out, and to the game's credit, there's a sizable number of nooks and crannies where it hides them, so I kept discovering some even after multiple playthroughs. Really, there's decent exploration value to be enjoyed throughout. It's just that the shrine sticks out with the most secrets, and it contains one of the very few examples where you need to use a particular weapon. This is a facet where the X series evidently shines brighter simply because the designers had a larger toolkit they could tap into. Even if the application of the weapon is mundane, the fact it's needed at all encourages players to consider their stage order beyond boss weaknesses, as optimal routing is paramount to minimizing backtracking. Perhaps Mega Man Zero could have reproduced some of this appeal had it locked several collectibles behind the elemental chips, but it doesn't seem interested in doing so. Given these factors, however, I do approve of the decision to move away from the traditional formula of making all main stages immediately accessible. This suited the X series' focus on earning boss weapons and locating various upgrades with them, but had the downside of not allowing a defined difficulty curve until the endgame. There's little escalation when the whole set is balanced, whereas if it's not balanced, players get punished for picking the wrong stages, so to speak. In Mega Man Zero, there's not much to gain anymore from opening up all the stages at once, and thus the game settled on more of a branching structure. Referencing this flowchart from Strategy Wiki, we can see, for example, that the first desert mission not only gates the secondary desert mission, but also the first hidden base mission. Meanwhile, your return to the intro stage, Underground Laboratory, opens up nothing until Neo Arcadia. This compromise retains some degree of choice, yet there's also room to scale the difficulty, which I'd say they do adequately. Secondary missions are always harder in some fashion than the first, not to mention the 4 Guardians with their multiple health bars are all reserved for secondary missions, and I'm willing to bet my channel that the majority of players have more trouble with the factory than the subway. Now don't take that too seriously. Anyway, I'm glad they've adopted a new progression structure. This was the right time for it, and complementing it is a hub area, also a first for 2D Mega Man. The Resistance Base. This is where you accept missions, manage your Cyber-Elves, etc. And one of the curious parts about it is how it connects directly to the stages. For instance, you can climb outside the base and walk into the disposal center to the right, or discover how the subway area links to the factory, a detail you'd miss when simply knocking out missions. Bear in mind, you can only start missions proper from the base itself, but otherwise this free roaming works as a good opportunity to collect Cyber-Elves you've missed, as well as grind and farm without jeopardizing your rank. Moreover, I find it fascinating to learn how close by all your operations are, and I can appreciate the attempt at more in-depth world building, with every mission also being contextualized to support and sustain the Resistance Base, whether it be securing the factory for energy supplies, pushing back against an incoming army, or rescuing soldiers who are being held captive. Rescued soldiers will then roam around the hub, serving as a reminder of what you're fighting for. It's a shame then that none of them really have anything to say beyond the thank you, especially given their dire predicament. Members of the Resistance Base are all taking shelter from Neo Arcadia, a utopian city that promised the dream of humans and Reploids living together in harmony, but soon began persecuting Reploids indiscriminately. Hearing first-hand anecdotes of what that terror was like or how life was prior to it would have added some nice detail and given the player extra motivation and reason to care about the Resistance Base. Granted, there is a memorable NPC or two, primarily Andrew, who tells a story of how he, as a Reploid, fell in love with a human woman many moons ago. The woman eventually grew jealous since Andrew didn't age, so he modified himself to be older, but then she naturally came to pass, and now the love and memories of her are what keep him going. On the surface, it's flavor text with no real relevance to the plot, but it illustrates how close the relationship between humans and Reploids can be with how far technology has come, and it begs the question how the average human citizen in Neo Arcadia feels about the ongoing Reploid genocide. I'm missing similar monologues from other NPCs that could give them individually more character, as well as enrich the player's understanding of the world around them. Unfortunately, the main cast isn't terribly compelling either, and we gotta start with Zero himself. You see, this game takes place approximately 100 years after the X series. Presumably, Zero has been asleep for most of that time, and so the writers decided to give him amnesia because of course. It's bad to the point he doesn't even know his name initially, which means Zero is more or less an empty vessel here. He does whatever the Resistance Base asks of him for no other reason than he's a hero, and doesn't offer his input on anything that's happening. When he's told early on that X, his dearest friend and battle partner before his slumber, is the one responsible for retiring the Reploids, he replies by saying the name X sounds familiar to him. That's literally it. By the same token, when CL implies she won't be happy until X is gone, Zero says he'll take care of him without a hint of hesitation or emotion. The impact of these moments is undermined by the utter lack of response from Zero, and for what benefit exactly? The amnesia adds nothing to this story, it only impedes it. Zero is the character we have a connection with jumping a century into the future, which should make him a perfect stand-in for the player, but instead we get a shadow of his former self, who couldn't seem more detached from his surroundings if he tried. As a result, there's also no chemistry between him and the leader of the Resistance, CL. She constantly, and I mean constantly, expresses her deepest gratitude and concern for Zero, but it's always a one-way street, with Zero blankly staring at her. I cannot tell if there was an intent for these two to grow a bond at all, and that's kind of a problem when most dialogue in the game comes from CL talking to Zero. It doesn't help that CL herself is a bit flat personality-wise too, though for what it's worth, she is the most well-realized character otherwise. Despite the incessant simping for Zero, it's refreshing she isn't another damsel in distress. As the leader of the Resistance, she put her life on the line to find and awaken Zero, and she works tirelessly behind the scenes to develop a substitute energy that could allow them to build a new life elsewhere, away from this old and ruined city where the base is currently situated. Not only that, CL is human, not a Reploid, but the reason she cares so much is because she's the one who created Neo Arcadia, as well as Copy X. Toward the end, she reveals it's not actually the real X oppressing Reploids, but instead a replica she made to fill the void left by the real X, who turned into a Cyber-Elf somewhere between the X series and this game. The current conflict is thus a result of her invention, but it's evident she's ashamed of it since it takes her so long to confess, and her decision to go underground with the Reploids instead of leaving them to rot does make her an honorable character. This brings us to Copy X as the villain, and I have some grievances with his portrayal. Let me explain. Throughout the X series, it was shown time and time again that humans and Reploids struggle to coexist. Reploids caused endless destruction and death, leaving X to fight and ruminate if there will ever be light at the end of the tunnel for nearly a century. Given that context, imagine if Copy X had a thought-out rationale where he studied history and decided to reject the real X's idealism. This drives him to cease development of Reploids and dispose of the ones that remain. It's not pretty, and Copy X realizes that, but he believes it's the only way to prevent further human suffering at the hands of Reploids. Almost sounds like it writes itself, right? Well, in the actual game, while Copy X does prioritize human well-being over Reploids, he doesn't explain himself whatsoever and comes across more as an egomaniac, gloating about being superior to the real X and then whining like an insecure loser when Zero easily defeats him. It's painfully by the numbers. I think he'd be less forgettable and more thematically fitting if he were depicted as more selfless. Upon closer examination, the story is steeped in moral ambiguity. It's easy to default to Zero being on the right side, but you have to wonder what the implications are of joining the Resistance. Is it correct to fight against the unjust treatment of a minority if it endangers the majority? There's an argument to be made that the creation of Reploids in the first place was a grave mistake, so when push comes to shove, is Reploid life really as valuable as human life? With Copy X dead, the ending is hardly celebratory either. The real X admits that the endless battles have taken their toll and he wishes to rest in peace for a while, passing the torch to Zero. Meanwhile, Neo Arcadia is destabilized and the accursed cycle of aggression continues, with chaos looming once more. Is this a better future than the one envisioned by Copy X? The game is deliberately ambivalent about the matter, leaving it up to the player to come to their own conclusions, whereas in the classic and X series, Dr. Wily's and Sigma's ambitions are pretty unabashedly evil. Truly, Mega Man Zero presents an intriguing setup and premise, emphasizing a more serious approach to storytelling. It's an ambitious and appreciable goal for sure, even if the final product has room for improvement. I've already discussed my issues with the characters, and next to that, the story is very light on exposition, which I can commend in a way. The opening in particular is great at getting you hooked with minimal dialogue. You witness Neo Arcadia's forces squashing resistance soldiers like flies underneath their feet, and by the time CL reaches Zero, her entire crew is wiped out. Zero then proceeds to obliterate the opposition, immediately highlighting both the ruthlessness of the enemy and Zero's immense power, and why CL was desperate to find him. Still, at some point you need to convey enough background and information if you want people to become truly invested in the world and its characters. A ton must have transpired between the X series and this game, yet the narrative focuses narrowly on moving you from point A to B. Why is Zero found in an abandoned lab attached to a Frankenstein machine with his arms missing? He was placed in a capsule fully intact in his ending in X6. What happened to X, and why is he a Cyber-Elf now? What's the origin of Cyber-Elves anyway? They weren't in the X games. Did CL know X, and if so, were they close at all? How long had Neo Arcadia existed before things went awry? I can go on, and I don't need concrete answers to all these questions, but it leaves somewhat of an empty feeling when absolutely none of it is explored. Of course, it's worth keeping in mind Inti Creates were not only working within the confines of a relatively short runtime, but also the GBA as a system. This could have influenced the outcome of things. They might have been wary of dumping too much dialogue on the player, and were probably still coming to grips with the handheld and how to optimize art for it. The presentation is fine by early GBA standards, but the shortcomings are obvious. You get the occasional digitized image, which is sweet, and the intro is pretty dynamic and interesting to watch, but past that, you'll mostly be staring at huge black text boxes with a single portrait for each character, while the sprites themselves stand there motionless. It's not particularly appealing to the eyes, and combined with stiff dialogue, the characters just aren't expressive. It falls well short of Metroid Fusion's cinematic presentation with its variety of different shots, and while Sonic Advance barely has a story, it does a better job bringing its characters to life with their distinct attitudes. Zero himself does move and attack smoothly in gameplay at least, which is the most important, but the animation elsewhere is kind of average, and the graphics in general just don't quite stack up to Metroid Fusion and Sonic Advance, both of which also came out in 2002. I know, the game's setting is supposed to be dystopian, but like, compare the wavy waters of Neo Green Hill with that slick line scrolling to the static blue shades of ocean in the subway. This about sums up the difference in quality. That being said, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the art style itself. I'm not entirely sure if they used digitized drawings or not, but either way, I think they managed to translate the sketchiness of the game's promotional material and such to the GBA pretty well. It's a really unique aesthetic, and the often relatively flat shading with a lack of granular detail lends itself well to such a low screen resolution. Some of the assets try to represent more detail and can look rather crude, however, and when juxtaposed against traditional pixel art for the character sprites, it's a little mismatched and jarring sometimes. It's clear that this is Inti Creates' first release on the system, but the visuals can only improve from here as the team gets more comfortable with the hardware and their design process. Moving over to the audio side of things, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised with it. Sound effects are crunchy and substantial. Hearing that Z-Saber rip apart enemies followed by an explosion never gets old. And for what feels like the first time ever, I can hold a charge without poisoning my ears, since they finally went for a charge sound that isn't whiny or high-pitched. Thank God. Instrument samples also pack a noticeable low end for the GBA. Bass lines are full and drums are punchy, meaning the audio engineers wanted the music to hold its own on proper equipment like headphones, which we still reap the benefits from today, especially via the DS and Zero ZX Legacy collections, which have clearer and less noisy processing. I'm not a fan of all the instrumentation per se, specifically the organ that is present in like half of the soundtrack, but I'm happy to take the good with the bad in this case. The score itself is also well composed, even if I find it somewhat forgettable overall. A decent chunk of it is more occupied with creating an atmosphere, which admittedly leads to some experimental soundscapes for a Mega Man game. And it complements the larger focus on world building, but it does strike me as a tad generic, especially when certain tunes are reused multiple times across different missions. I think the direction would maybe work better if every stage received its own piece. That's not to say there are no energetic tracks, by the way. There are, but not as many as in any given X installment, and definitely not as many bangers. The only two themes that go hard in my opinion are Crash for boss battles, and Enemy Hall, which stands as not only the most memorable track in the game by a country mile, but one of the most memorable tracks in franchise history. Whenever I think of this music and dwarfing Neo Arcadia, I'm reminded of how fun Mega Man Zero can be. There's a good game here beneath the flaws, one I choose to replay over something like X5 any day, and if you're looking to get into the Zero saga, I think it's still worth experiencing this first installment. It's gonna be a bumpy ride if you play it in its original form, but Save Assist mode in the Zero ZX Legacy Collection significantly reduces the learning curve, making it much easier to enjoy the core gameplay and content on offer. What Mega Man Zero fails at, however, is being a convincing start. The game certainly has promising and interesting ideas, and some are executed well, but too many of them are not. This contrasts with Mega Man X, which was a resounding success that revitalized Capcom's flagship IP when it was starting to stagnate. There are criticisms I can bring up for X1, sure, but it was an excellent jump into the next generation and rightfully remains one of the most beloved Mega Man releases ever. Zero One, on the other hand, doesn't have much of a legacy and epitomizes first game syndrome. The sequels have their work cut out for them to refine and develop the unique potential of Mega Man Zero and solidify it as a series that stands alongside Mega Man Classic and Mega Man X. So, to be continued.